But what I will say is what they're doing a lot more of now is they're looking at polygenic risk factors. So they're looking at maybe not like they're studying in a way where, okay, it would be great to find candidate genes. And I do have some research on more and more candidate genes being found that are, consistent with these personality presentations. But really, we're talking about polygenic risk, and we're talking about everybody has a certain level of, risk for anything in their genes. So what would make a potential risk factor for somebody developing narcissism is if, the differences in the DNA are, if there's enough of those differences, let's say on average there's 500. If somebody has like 2,000 of those differences that are risk factors for grandiosity, they are that much more likely. Those little tiny things have a strong additive effect. So it's like we're not looking at one or two really powerful genes that like have the whole profile in them. We're looking more like there's probably thousands and thousands of little ones that cumulatively create this additive effect where now the influence from the genetic side of the narcissism is like what we're like passing 50%, maybe 60%, right? And so that's sort of a very simplistic version of it, and I probably didn't do it justice, but that's what they're really trying to identify more is differences in the DNA sequence that are particular risk factors, and how many of those together influence, you can kind of quantify the degree of the trait,
Right.
We see this with like depression too. Like we all have the same genes that could be potential risk factors for developing like a clinical depression. The ones who have the clinical depression have a lot more of those, in their genome. And so those ones are contributing to the probability that person could develop something like, major depression, more so than someone who has a lot less of those risk factor genes, right?
Right. Okay.
There's a real surge on the right of interest in mothers and motherhood, like Miriam Cates and the Tories and some others sort of worrying about the birth rate, which is low, and saying, a government has to do something radical around mothers. And I think a lot of the time it ends up basically sounding like a very unattractive prospect for women about staying at home, which most women, I think rightly so, aren't interested in. On the other hand, on the sort of, I guess, on the left, there's just sort of a disengagement completely with the fact that lots of women would like to be at home more than they are, because lots of women are having to be out at work, putting their kids in expensive childcare when, in fact, is making them very unhappy. So I'm thinking about something to do with, and on top of all of that, we've never been so interventionist into parenting and particularly motherhood ever. The NHS literally puts out adverts telling you how to look at your child. I mean, literally, there was a really great advert on a bus stop near me that said, playing peekaboo, create something like, it was put in the child's voice. If you play peekaboo with me, it builds brain synapses in my, it's like,
right.
Yeah, so play peekaboo with your child, not because you love them, but because it builds their brain synapses. So there's just a lot happening in the world of parenting and motherhood. So I'm thinking about something like writing about bad mums and why it's good to be a bad mum in a way, and just reject all of this kind of stuff, and give your kids the chocolate buttons and wash and have a good time. So, that's, but no.
Save the biohacking for later. Just enjoy your children. I get that.
Our traditional models have been, and this is the basis for all anger management classes and therapies. Our initial model has been human beings don't aggress unless they're scared in some way. They fear something, and they fear that if they don't aggress in some way or respond angrily, that they'll be hurt. So fear is the motivator in the traditional framework, and you become angry at some perceived assault, and then you lash out. And that's a valid model for some behaviors. But instrumental aggression is different, and it's not based in fear. And that's where I gave the example in the book of the cat. The cat who is reacting in fear. It's very interesting. It displays certain behaviors. Let's say it feels threatened because a pit bull terrier is approaching it, and it feels like it might become injured. Well, it does certain things. It arches its back and its hair stands on end, and it shows its claws and it hisses, makes noise, and it threatens. But it really doesn't want to fight. It doesn't want to pick a fight. It just wants the threat to go away. Its behavior when it's in the instrumental or predatory mode is entirely different. It's quiet and stealthy. It's calm. It's not nervous. It's not upset. It's just full of desire and hunger. And it's careful, and it's measured, and it doesn't signal that aggression is coming. And it aggresses out of pure desire. So fear is not the motivator. The cat about to eat the mouse is not afraid of the mouse. It's not reacting because it fears what the mouse might do to it if it doesn't eat it. It's a whole different model. And by the way, what I've just described is why most anger management classes don't work. It's because the model is backward for most cases. Many times they refer the kinds of folks that we call the angry driver, that's a misnomer to begin with, to these classes because they're constantly, running red lights and getting into trouble and doing, cussing out people when they have benders and whatnot. It's a misnomer that they're the angry driver. They just want to get from place A to place B in 0.5 seconds, and they don't care who they run over in the process. When they become angry is when something gets in the way. They're already in the aggressive mode of behavior way before they ever get angry. Anger is not the precipitant. It's the result of the frustration of the aggressive style, which usually they show in every other aspect of their lives too. So what I quickly found out after all these people were being referred to anger management classes is they're in the wrong class. We need them in aggression replacement classes, and there's a whole different model for that.
I think one of the other things that confuses a lot of people, and I think you've been asked about this in quite a few interviews, but it's almost as if when we think about like what the subjective experience of a narcissist is, it's almost as if it kind of feels like Invasion of the Body Snatchers in the sense there's like this dark entity in there, and it's kind of scanning for information, and then it's going to use that information very strategically at the right point. Is obviously I know that's a little bit science fiction, but is there two of them in that sense, or is it just one bigger personal experience for them? Are they just like a chameleonic?
Yeah.
Or does that make sense?
Yeah. Hopefully I'm answering this correctly based on the question. I don't personally believe that there is like an entity or a separate part of them that is like malignant that's fueling this, and then maybe the rest of them are like just a normal person. Mm-hmm. I think that when we really extensively study trait excess and trait deficiency, it's really interesting how much that research has provided as far as just how important traits are. Traits aren't, when I talk about trait, a personality trait is the tendency to perceive, believe, think, feel, and act in relatively stable ways across time, because it's just that trait is fueling your perception. And so that's how those are the lenses with which you view the world. And so you're taking that trait with you everywhere. I think that trait deficiency and trait excess could better explain what's going on with these people, rather than like this dark entity that sometimes comes online and takes over them, and then they go back to their normal self. For example, somebody who really does have a deficit in empathy, it doesn't mean that they're a monster, but what it does mean is the cues that typically would signal physiologically, cognitively, and even in their subjective feeling state that someone's like in pain as a result of something they did, that just doesn't register for them, right? So someone on the receiving end of that is going to feel that void. It's almost like getting sucked into the vacuum of space. Like, wow, you're supposed to be showing up in some way right now, but I'm looking at you and it looks like you're dead. You're a goat. Like, and it's scary. You're frightening me. That's because they don't have the ability to register even like the facial expression of that person in pain in a way where it causes their system to go, oh my gosh, I know what that's like. I can never, I don't want anyone to be in that level of pain. I'm here for them. I'm with them. They don't have that experience. Their experience can range from not now, I don't have time, to I think I'm supposed to be feeling something right now, but I just don't, to it actually makes me feel a little aroused that you're so worked up and in pain. So there's this spectrum of this callous, unemotional trait constellation, if you will, and those are the ones that are in the narcissists. So I think that if you look at it from that perspective and you really study what these traits are, it makes more sense to see that those are fueling the engine rather than like this entity that they get overcome by, and then they go back to their baseline after the entity kind of lets them go, or they get their fix or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, I follow you. Yeah, it's difficult. It's like your intellect can only take you so far with this stuff. I mean, if someone said to me, Miles, can you just try and imagine what it would be like to not care at all? As much as I would try, I'm just not going to get there. It's just, so it's like kind of trying to see beyond the horizon. It's like, you can't do it. So right. I think people come up with all of these different concepts to try and kind of explain something that they'll just never be able to grasp.
To your point, the narcissist can't live in a world where their grandiose trait isn't like at the forefront of their life. So they can't imagine what it would be like to not be the top person or the most important person. And honestly, that is often what causes their distress. Is they feel like they're a fish out of water because people are telling them that they're not, kind, or that they're insensitive, or that they think that they're too great. And the person with the grandiosity trait is like, but I am that great. And so why are you? I don't understand why you're trying to like provoke me or give or create a problem here. Like, just accept reality as it is. They'll get into distress over that. I've seen them. It's not the kind of distress though that like, oh my gosh, I'm suffering. This is so hard. It's more like they're offended. They get worked up because they can't figure out why you don't know who they are. Really, they sincerely are concerned about that. Why don't you know who I am?
Would you going back to your book, which I think came out in 2017, didn't it? If you were to write that again, would that sound much different, do you think? Or do you kind of look back at it and think, no, my views have pretty much stayed the same?
They've stayed the same, but interesting things have changed with the times. So obviously I was writing in 2017. It was like a post-Me Too criticism of feminism. It was saying there are problems for women, but hang on, we've just lived through a moment in which, people were literally saying we're like in The Handmaid's Tale. Life for women is a horror show. And so I came along and said, that's not true. Obviously, it's not true. And why, when women are doing really well in many ways, and that doesn't mean life is perfect, but, women are doing really well. Life is better for us than it was for our grandmothers and our mothers. And, why are we now being so pessimistic? And, in a nutshell, I think there was a kind of a bit of the Me Too movement was sort of an expression of the sort of moral panic around women's safety. And so I came up with this idea that, I sort of tried to argue that, you can't have two things at the same time. You can't have a panic about women's safety and a defense of women's freedom at the same time, because the panic about safety is calling for paternalistic, protectionist kind of measures. So, more regulations, more bodyguards in clubs, more policemen on the streets, more and more sort of being watched by
authority of some
male
kind.
authorities. Yeah. And I don't think that's changed. In fact, actually, in some ways, I think it's gotten worse, because we're sort of, women's politics is sort of in an odd space at the moment, because really terrible things have happened, like the grooming gangs in the UK and the rape scandals there. But there's been no like Me Too movement for those girls and women. So it's a bit messed up. But I think the thing that has changed, which is interesting in the world of women and feminism, is obviously the trans issue, which funnily enough has, brought women that I would have been, I suppose, in many ways politically opposed to in terms of my views on feminism. We're now sort of thick as thieves, because you sort of park that issue to deal with the fact that there are all these men pretending to be women and, doing all that kind of stuff. So it's been like a weird kind of, 5 to 8 years where things have just been so strange and the issue's completely changed that I guess now any sort of discussion about women's politics would have to kind of, annoyingly in a way, have to address the fact that we've been forced to deal with these men for that long. So but I think the issues today still are very much the idea that any kind of feminism has to be rooted in this sort of absolute, I think, hypersensitivity around women's safety, which doesn't, crucially, I think, doesn't do anything good and necessary for, changing domestic violence rates or, any of the very real issues that women face. It's not really doing anything for that. It's just sort of paying lip service. So when you say operate a middle ground, I think, oh God, do I? Because I most of the time, I think I don't like nuance, particularly with this issue around sort of women. I think that there's been too much wishy-washiness, and actually any kind of future women's liberation movement, which I do think we need, does have to be quite hardcore.
Dopamine has become like one of the most used words in the English language over the last 10 years.
Yes.
It's even ended up in I saw like a song name with dopamine in it recently. I've seen an album name that, called Dopamine. I feel like most people, you feel free to push back on this, but I feel like most people at least have like a decent grasp on what it is. I think people associate it with like motivation, the pursuit of a goal. Is that broadly speaking, is that what it is? And what are the main misconceptions you think, people have about dopamine?
Yeah, I honestly didn't realize this until recently, as you said, how misunderstood this is with the public. Because I feel like in some of my other platforms that I work for, they're like, Christy, can you please make talks on this? So these are the questions people have. And I'm like, I didn't know there was so much confusion around this. But yeah, I mean, it really is like one of the most misunderstood molecules on the internet right now. And I think kind of, as you said, I think a lot of this misconception just kind of derives from that it's simply either just only from reward, motivation, or this pleasure chemical. And, as in life and in science, and that I always try to like really bring home to everyone, there's nuance to everything in life. So yes, dopamine is involved in reward. It is involved in motivation and learning, as well as movement, attention, prediction, reinforcement. And, it's not also just about pleasure. It's really kind of like deeply rooted in like helping your brain learn about what is important and what is worth pursuing. And I think a better way to
like the ability to discern is like dopamine is a factor there. Is that what we're saying? Yeah.
Yep. And I think the best way to kind of describe it, as you were saying, it's really to teach people of like, it's basically teaching your brain of what to pay attention to, and then what behaviors are worth repeating. And so I'm sure you've probably seen this too, like in the wellness culture. I've seen so much of people claiming like dopamine detoxes, which honestly, I don't even know what the hell that means. But, if this,
is that physiologically possible to do that, or no? Okay.
That's where I really don't understand where this came from, but they're kind of treating it as it's like this toxin that you need to cleanse from your brain, but this really is not how this works. I mean, you can't detox dopamine. This is something that you really need to function every day. And, if you really didn't have any dopamine signaling in your brain, you would have serious problems with movement, motivation, cognition, reward. And so I think what people are trying to articulate is just reducing these overstimulating behaviors where it kind of gives you this compulsive like reward loop, like constantly scrolling on your phone and checking social media, gambling, playing games on your phone, just really this excessive novelty seeking. And I think this really is an important conversation to have, but calling it a detox is really misleading to the public. I think a better way to reframe this is, not how do you get rid of this, but how do I change my environment? How do I change my habits so then, my attention and my behavior aren't constantly being robbed or, distracted?
In developing a very fulfilling relationship with many disturbed characters on various places on the spectrum over the years, and watching lives change in the process, I began to research and write about what I call the 10 Commandments of Character, the essential lessons that we seem to have trouble learning in modern culture, that are the most essential principles for forging a wholesome character and for developing the capacity to love. And I'm not talking about love's many imposters, because there's a lot of things that look like love that aren't. But I uncovered these general principles. I didn't discover them because I just reframed what sages throughout the ages have always known. But I also looked deeply into the psychological principles at work and what we'd have to do to develop these characteristics, like overcoming our innate egocentricity, seeing the bigger picture. That's the first commandment. Dealing with our innate sense of entitlement, and developing a sense of gratitude, appreciating the gift that this life is, somewhat beholding to the universe, if you will, if you're not one to particularly be a fan of the God framework, or you don't really recognize a God, or your version of God is some mythical kind of thing. Having a respect for the truth, learning to control our impulses, training our wills. All these principles that I write about are the essential commandments for developing sound character. And it's hard work. We have to have the right motivation. This is the thing that we have forgotten, and this is where culture and character have a dynamic interplay, because people comprise the culture, right? And their collective character defines cultural values. And what's been going on for several decades now is that we had certain aspects of the culture that encouraged and reinforced us being relatively decent people. But as more and more character impaired people populated the society, those cultural norms changed. Those cultural institutions and structures designed to preserve and foster and develop and reward character got corrupted. And as that happened, then more and more character impaired people emerged, and vice versa, a true vicious cycle of sorts, a dynamic influencing, counter influencing of culture and character. And we need to take a serious look at that. And we're probably not going to do it by addressing those aspects of our culture that have been detrimental to our character formation. How I think we're going to have to do it, as I outline in Essentials for the Journey, is one heart at a time, starting with our own.